we can start recording. Thank you very much. Okay, well, welcome everybody to the Wednesday evening presentation of the Faversham Tree Week. This is our second go at having a tree week, and because of the lockdown we have moved it all online, and so we're very, very pleased tonight to have David Carey as our speaker to talk. He's going to give us a virtual guided walk looking at some of the extraordinary trees in Faversham, and in this case along through the Westbrook stream, which is really part of the ancient origins of Faversham over that side. And if you don't know him, if you haven't met him or come across him in these meetings already, he's sort of the eminence grise of the Kent Tree and Pond Wardens group, and he also works at Hadlow College and has been a tower of strength both this year and last year for our events and as a source of reference for things we want to do. So I won't take up any more of your time, but hand over to him and say how very, very glad we are to have you, David, and looking forward to your talk very much. Okay, over to you.
Well, hello and good evening to everybody, and welcome to our virtual walk, which tonight is going to be along the Westbrook stream through the middle of Faversham. It's an amazing little environment here. So just going to lead you through the walk with a PowerPoint of the various trees, which I hope will stand up to the experience, and just talk about them. If there are any burning questions, do feel free to interrupt, and you know, somehow or other we'll get that sorted. But otherwise, if people want to use the chat and just put some thoughts in there, some questions or anything like that, I think there's a chat button that you can use, and we'll try and gather some questions together at the end if we have time. Righty-ho, so this is our virtual walk, and I'm going to start it at the, it's interesting, no movement on the screen as yet. So, oh, there we go. That's it. Sorry, just a little bit slow. So the bit we're going to be looking at is we're going to be walking from the road just along by Stonebridge Pond there, and we're going to be walking up this green path, which I'm sure all of you know, and along past the old mill, the old chart mill, and up as far as this bridge here. And as you can see, this is marked as green space. So this is officially part of Faversham's green space to be preserved for the future. Now, because we're going to start at the pond, just by that sign there, which I think most of you might be able to recognize, I did just want to mention a few of the trees around the start before we actually get along the stream a bit. And I wanted to mention this particular tree, which is sitting in the middle of the pond there, and it's actually a grey willow, at least as far as I can tell. It's a bit difficult to get close to it, to check its leaves very carefully. And I can't find an island underneath it that it's standing on. I'm sure there's something in there, but it seems to be pretty well surrounded by water and almost submerged and still thriving. It's a rather amazing tree to see to start off with, a tree growing in the middle of a pond. And it's a beautiful pond, this, and it's surrounded by all sorts of lovely trees, both native and exotic. And this one in particular here, which some of you may know, is a really rather special horse chestnut. In fact, I've only seen a few of these in Kent, less than a handful of these in Kent. This is the pink horse chestnut, Aesculus planteriensis, named after a nursery in France from where it was deliberately bred. And it's the most attractive tree, and it certainly gets a lot of recognition county-wide, and people will actually come and see it in Faversham because it's such a splendid tree. And I would hardly recommend that next time it's in flower that you pop down to have a look at it. Next tree I wanted to mention is just on the other side of the stream to our path, and it's one of these beautiful little cherries there that the council has planted. Unfortunately, it's been a little bit subject to damage, and it's a real shame, because if it is lost, then unfortunately we'll lose some of the beautiful autumn colour that these cherries provide. Not quite sure which variety it is, but it's a definite plus in the autumn colour spectrum, just on the other side of the stream. And the other tree that's sitting there, just by the start of our walk, is a field maple. And it's really nice to see some native trees along the stream because, of course, this gives us the opportunity to get a few native insects. Now, unfortunately, we won't have time tonight to look at all the biodiversity aspects of all the trees that we're going to look at. So I've just picked a couple of things out. And on field maple, what you will find is that it has these seeds and these fruits that fall down onto the floor. And this is a picture taken in summer of the colourful fruits before they go brown. When they do go brown, you might be lucky enough, if you look closely, to see these little tracks on the fruit. And right at the start of the track, you can see a little silvery blob, which is the remnant of a tiny caterpillar's egg that has been laid there by a moth. Now, this particular moth is a micro moth, and it is entirely dependent upon the field maple. It doesn't live on any other tree at all. The moth lives as a larva on the buds in the spring, and then in the summertime it has a second generation. It comes along, lays its eggs on the fruit, and a little caterpillar just literally chews its way through the fruit towards the seed and starts to eat the seed, and then pupates over winter until the life cycle starts again. And we get all these different specific animals on specific trees, and you'll find lots of examples of them along the walk that we're going to do tonight. And unfortunately, we won't have time to mention them all, but this is probably one of my favorites. As we get started to move along the path, one thing we'll notice is these big, tall Italian-style poplars on the other side of the stream. And there's three of them. They're quite tall. They're really quite an important part of the Faversham tree scene because these large mature trees here are really quite important for birds and bats and things like that. And if you look across the roofscapes, you'll find tall trees like this in Faversham form a little bit of a network for bats to move to as they're foraging along. This particular form of poplar, this upright form of poplar, is a cultivated variety. It's sort of like the original Lombardy poplar, but in fact it's a hybrid created again in a nursery in France and planted widely. I think there are about 6 or 7 clones of this planted widely across the whole of Northwest Europe. And if you're looking at a tall poplar tree in the British countryside, it's almost certainly going to be this one, Plantieriensis, is the name given to these particular hybrids that are grown in Northern Europe. And it's got leaves that look a little bit like this, slightly downy when they open up. This is an idealized picture of the leaf without any insects or fungi on. One of the things I particularly like about the native trees is the fact they do get sort of damaged, if you see what I mean, by the various insects and things that attack them. And I like to see that a little bit on my trees because I like to think of things actually living on the trees and them not being entirely sterile exotic trees. As we start to move along the path, we notice these horse chestnuts right next to the stream, in fact, and they've had to be pollarded. They've had to be cut back in order to keep them under control. But you can see that there are plenty of leaves and shoots springing from the trunk, and so they are repopulating themselves in terms of foliage. And this is actually rather like a typical medieval way of treating trees. You would remove lots of the vegetation from the trees, and then as they regrew up and down the trunk, then you would probably cut those off from the tree in order to feed your cattle and other livestock over the winter. And this was called shredding, and was something that we don't do very much nowadays. I do sometimes wonder whether we're actually missing out by not managing the trees in some ways similar to the way that they did in medieval times, because we've changed the trees into something that is perhaps less useful ecologically in some ways. Some of these horse chestnuts are completely covered with ivy, which is something, that we might come back to. later on in the talk, but ivy is a hugely important thing for wildlife. It's a nectar source for late bees, honeybees, hoverflies, butterflies, and all sorts of other insects that depend on them. This is one of the major late flowering plants in our countryside, and extremely important for keeping our insects going. These horse chestnuts are really, despite the fact they might look a bit untidy, they're really quite important ecologically in the middle of the town here. And when you actually take a closer look at the top of them, you'll find there are little cracks and bumps and crevices. And up in the top right of this particular picture, you can see a very neat little crevice. And that, I think, is almost certainly just about the right size for a pipistrelle or perhaps slightly larger bat to come in and roost. And we need an awful lot of roosts for bats scattered around the town, because normally a bat won't roost in the same place all the time, but it will move from one roost to another, perhaps only spending 2 or 3 nights, two or three days, I'm sorry, in each roost while it's happy, and then it'll move on to another one as conditions change and so on. So it's lovely little bit, and I would love to have a bat detector out during the summer and just see whether any bats are coming out of these trees or using these cracks for roosting in. So there's just a picture as we move along there. If we just look slightly to our left-hand side, we'll find 2 smaller trees planted in amongst the grass there. And I'm really pleased to say that there's a lady who lives there who's taking care of these trees and make sure that they're properly managed and so on, and protected in particular from council strimmers. These are Rowan's mountain ash, and they've got the most wonderful berries on them. And these berries tend to be loved. Certainly the Rowan I have in my back garden is absolutely attacked by the blackbirds every autumn. And it's a really rather wonderful thing to see all the berries being used by the birds. It's one of the things they seem to manage to strip my tree within about 10 days. And it's just wonderful to see them calling in excitement as they descend upon the tree, and then of course they're gone within a few days. But the wildlife value of Rowan isn't only with its fruit; it's with its flower in the spring, which to us smells rather off. I always think Rowan flowers do a little bit off and over, but does seem to attract the most amazing array of insects. So all credit. It just goes to show what people can do, even if they're only working on their own, just taking care of trees in the middle of towns. So congratulations to the lady who is doing that. As we move further along, we'll actually find some ash trees, both small and old, along the side of the stream here. And here's just looking straight up, and you can see ash leaves right at the top of this particular ivy covered tree. And it's really nice to see some ash trees in the town. The canopy does look just a fraction thin on this. And we do worry whether some of these ash trees are going to have to be replaced as they get attacked by ash dieback and so on. But the ones along the stream there, they seem to be doing pretty well, I must say, and not to be suffering too much from the disease. So we hope that they're only going to be lost gradually and slowly, and they'll be with us for many, many years to come along the Westbrook walk that we're doing here tonight. Moving on, the other tree that we find quite commonly along this walk is going to be the sycamore. And this just a close up at this most remarkable bark that you get on sycamores, which is really most beautiful thing. And you can see somebody's just used a felt tip pen just to make their mark upon the tree. I don't think it's done any damage, but I think that's rather sweet. And if you look carefully, just a little bit northeast of that, you can also see the remnants of an insect cocoon there. It just goes to show that bark and all the crevices of bark host a huge number of insects and microorganisms as well. And a tree like a sycamore here has got really quite a good diversity of insects and other life associated with it. As you move along the path, you start to notice that some of the trees there are really quite large, and this is a good medium-sized tree along here. And this one, from the leaves, appears to be a horse chestnut. And I'm really glad to say that the council hasn't sort of made the path run straight over the roots and has diverted the path around the tree. And I think this is absolutely wonderful, sort of thing they're now doing in Sheffield after a huge amount of pressure has been put on the town council to manage their trees properly. They now actually manage their trees with which values their trees and makes sure that the trees are considered as an asset rather than just a nuisance. But if you look carefully at the base of this horse chestnut, as you go past it next time, you'll see these little fungal brackets. And I think this one, I can't be absolutely sure, but I think this one might be the artist's bracket. It's a species of Ganoderma. And it's called the artist's bracket because you can actually write on those white surfaces. That's not something I'd really want to do, but you can do the most incredible drawings on those. And it's sort of like a woodcut in a way. You see these little brown marks wherever you press or write on the surface of the bracket at this point. Now, this tree is actually growing quite well. It's recovering from some topping operations. It's definitely still alive. But what the fungus is doing is eating away the middle of the trunk. It's just hollowing out the tree. And you might expect this tree to be able to live for quite a while if it doesn't get any other diseases, even though it may become hollow. And that's probably the natural state of many of the older trees in our natural environment. So there's nothing to worry about too much. And the council is sort of well aware of it and will keep an eye on it and make sure that it doesn't pose a problem, safety hazard or anything like that to people walking along the path. So a lovely thing to see. As we move further along, we notice there's a huge amount of really good plants, water plants in the stream. And this is all thanks to the Westbrook and Stonebridge Friends of, who take care of the stream, clear it all out. Wonderful group, and very much to be commended for the huge amount of work that they have done. Of course, as you think about the stream and all that clean water and wildlife in it, you'll be thinking about things like bats moving along these trees just by the watercourse and eating up all the midges in a summer night. This is the common pipistrelle. I think it's common pipistrelle. It's got a little bit of a bandit face on it, hadn't it? A little bit of a mask. So you might need to check the species of this one. These bats are absolutely amazing, but they do depend on the trees as well as the water along this walk. There are some species of bat that have been shown don't like to go too far away from trees and may not cross anything much bigger than 5 or 10 meter gap between trees. So it's important to keep the connectivity of trees along the Westbrook going. As we move along, we'll see a rather nice young yew tree just as we turn the bend along the path here, and I'm going to come back to yews a little bit later on. I noticed there aren't any berries on this, and sometimes you find yews without many berries, and sometimes you find them absolutely plastered in berries. I'll be quite interested to know why that is, if anybody's got any good ideas on that. So as we continue to move, we notice there are different types of trees. There's conifer behind there, which I haven't actually managed to identify. And then we've got this lime tree here. And you can usually recognize a lime tree by looking at the base of the tree, and quite often the common lime, which is a hybrid tree, has these little shoots growing around the base of it. This can be a real nuisance when the trees are planted in pavements, but it is an indication that it's common lime, and usually these are very cheaply and quickly produced, and these cultivars produce these basal shoots at the base of the tree here. You can get limes which don't do this, and you can get limes which equally don't drop sap on your cars. And I would highly recommend, that you think carefully about the type of tree you plant. This is rather beautiful lime tree. And while you're sort of looking down at the ground there and thinking, Oh yes, it's common lime. You must remember that Christmas is approaching, and if you look up the top, and I don't know how many know this path, but there are these absolutely gigantic clumps of mistletoe, about 40 foot above your head. So the next time you're walking along the path, you can grab your opportunity, and whoever you're walking with, or indeed a passing stranger if you're brave enough, you could give them a quick kiss and say, well, you're under the mistletoe, and see whether you get away with it. Probably best not to attack a stranger, actually, come to think of it. Maybe not. There are quite a few elders along the path here, but they're mainly young saplings. They don't seem to last very long for one reason or another. And the elder is, of course, quite a magical tree, and it's very much associated with all sorts of stories in folklore, witchcraft and wizardry, as in Harry Potter's wand and so on. It's a bit of a stinky tree. And it's probably got a bit of a bad reputation being associated with Judas in the Bible and so on. It's quite a strange tree to have, but it's really nice to have around. And none of the trees along the path are unfortunately big enough to give us a really good show of flower or of berry. So it's a little bit difficult to think of making elderflower champagne or elderberry wine out of them. But it's a nice tree to see. This is a rather strange looking tree. I don't know where this one came from, but it's along one of the fences there. I don't know whether it's a tree or not, but it looks like a tree to me. Rather nice to think, that one could do a decent mural along this and get some of the youngsters involved, maybe in doing a rather nice decoration along some of these fences. Here. And just at this point, if you know the path, there are some really rather wonderful shrubs. So here we've got ivy flowers. This is a picture taken a few weeks ago, and this particular ivy bush was absolutely covered with the insects, the wasps, the bees, the hoverflies, and other flies. It was really very, very attractive to the late pollinating flowers, and it's really rather beautiful little spot. Somebody's planted a rather wonderful pyracantha, possibly orange glow, and this is rather good plant for insects in spring when it's in flower, and it's also got a rather wonderful leaf miner on the leaves of those. So again, full of insects, as well as being very, very pretty. And then of course there's clematis. Can't remember all the names of the clematis. This may be something like Clematis alpina, and it's really a beautiful little spot along the walk. And that's where the thing is. Somebody's obviously a very good gardener at this particular point, and they've got some young trees here. And that yellowish one in the center of the photo, it's a variegated form of Lawson cypress, which was brought over from West America around in the early 19th century. And there are now over 200 different varieties of Lawson cypress that are quite commonly grown around the world. And this one changes color over the seasons, differently yellow and green and so on. And it's really quite a beautiful tree. And it's obviously very, very happy in Faversham soil because of the way that its flowers, if I can say that a conifer flowers, and fruits produces its cone in huge abundance in this particular spot. And as you move just sort of further along the walk, and we're approaching Chart Mill at the moment, there is this rather nice lime tree, rather similar to the one we saw earlier on with a few shoots around the base, but you can see from this picture how it's had to be controlled and its top has been cut off. And if we just go a little bit closer into that, you can see the top of the trunk there is full of cracks and little opportunities for fungi and microorganisms to grow, and opportunities for birds to nest and bats to roost. And so although the tree may to us look like it's not in its natural form, nature never misses an opportunity, and it wants to come in and make use of that, and probably increase the biodiversity rather than decreasing it. And it's just such a beautiful spot along this. Just looking back from where we were, we've got these wonderful bridges, and I've got a feeling that we probably get some of the water hunting bat species, the Dorbenton's bat, might well want to roost underneath that bridge and then feed along the stream and perhaps on the Stonebridge Pond as well. So it's partly a matter of keeping the trees along this beautiful green lane, but also thinking about the man-made infrastructure, which also impacts upon the life of the stream and the wildlife associated with this incredible diversity of trees. And just we're walking along here today, I did take time to have a listen. There's an incredible starling roost there. This is young or immature starling, and they're the most beautiful colour at this time of year, the young birds are. Really wonderful to hear large numbers of them. Surprisingly enough, a declining species. So nice to hear that they're doing well in Faversham and can be heard on these late autumn, early winter days. And then you turn around the corner and you're faced with this huge, gigantic tree, which is actually a form of plane tree. And it's got a very swollen trunk. We sometimes call this the baobab plane because of its swollen trunk. It's indicative of being quite an old tree, but some of them go this way and some of them don't. And nobody really knows why some of them develop these hugely swollen trunks. And you can see that it's actually almost bursting out of its planting spot there and trying to creep over all the paving, and it's actually eating some of these edging slabs here, growing around it very nicely indeed. And this is a really quite important tree, and looking at it close, you can see how warty and knobbly the tree is. And just referring to this map here, you can see that it's actually marked on the ancient tree inventory map of the Woodland Trust. It's one of the few trees that's marked in the middle of Faversham as being a rather amazing tree that's worthy of national note. It's marked with an N for a notable tree. Don't think we could yet call it a veteran tree, although it's on its way to becoming a veteran or ancient tree. And it's really quite a remarkable thing to see. It is gigantic and a lovely tree to come across right in the middle of the town, next to the archaeology of the mill. And right next to it, there is a yew tree that actually has quite a lot of the so-called berries on it. They're not real berries because it's not a flowering plant, it's a conifer. But just a reminder that all parts of the yew are toxic, are poisonous and shouldn't be eaten. I know some people are into botanics and so on, and unfortunately I think a young man was killed by brewing up a whole load of yew trees just I think it was 2019, and decided to give yew trees a go, boiled a whole load of them up and drank the resulting liquor and was unfortunately killed. The only part of the yew tree that is actually safe to eat are these orangey fleshy bits around the seed. So if you can separate the orange fleshy bit from the seed, you can actually eat them. They are a bit sickly, they're sweet and sickly. They are the favorite food of the mistle thrush. And today, as I was going past the tree, I was really delighted to hear a mistle thrush calling and obviously enjoying eating these particular fruits. It's a rather strange ecology evolved in this, though, because mistle thrush is absolutely delirious with pleasure at finding all these yew berries, eats a huge number of them, and usually eats too much and actually is sick almost straight away on surrounding bits of grass and bits of woodland and so on. And that's how the seeds get spread by the mistle thrushes overindulging. Very strange sort of setup, really. And there's a picture of a mistle thrush stolen off the internet, just to remind you what I'm talking about. Beautiful bird with a rather raucous call. And just a little bit further along, there's a rather amazing cherry tree. This being attacked by a fungus called nectria, which has almost broken through the entire middle of the tree, but the tree is obviously trying to recover and producing new branches in between the old ones. That's very unusual and rather strange sort of setup. And just looking back along the path, there's the mill with its stones and wheels and so on, and a rather beautiful little picnic area. just really suitable for just sort of pausing and reflecting on life, bang in the middle of the town. It's a rather wonderful walk altogether, and certainly a green oasis. It's a really beautiful thing to see. Now, on the left-hand side there, we can see a beautifully barked tree, more of which later. As we go past the mill and cross the road, then there is this beautiful golden weeping willow, which has actually been nominated for Faversham's favourite tree, entries for which, by the way, are still open right until Sunday afternoon. We're going to be judging all the entries Sunday afternoon about 2 p.m, trying to pick 3 trees to represent Faversham's favourite tree. And it's amazing to look at this tree, because actually when you get close to it, it is a really quite gigantic trunk on the base of this tree. And in fact, this tree has not yet been put on the ancient tree inventory, but I feel that if somebody ran a tape measure around it, it could well go on the list, at least as a notable tree, if not a veteran tree. It's a rather wonderful example of a golden weeping willow that is just so architectural. And here's another view of it, with next to it a tree that, if it were on its own, would be highly valued, I'm sure. Beautiful silver birch. And this I always feel slightly sorry for this birch, because it's right next to this spectacular weeping willow. And you know, you might say to yourself, well, if that weeping willow wasn't there, I could come into my full glory, as it were, and be fully appreciated. And this little spot here, in amongst the trees, has some incredible trees close to it on this little triangle. This one is actually a silver maple. It's from Northeast America. It's related to the sugar maple that people would tap, and it's got the most beautiful leaves on it that are very, very good for making mandalas if you have the time and patience to do that sort of thing. So a bit of tree art can be gained from this. This picture was taken today, so it's lost all its leaves, unfortunately. I always enjoy this tree because it's carried with it several of the insects from Northeast America, little mites and insects and things like that, which can only be found on this species of tree because they're not used to our European trees, and they've come across with the trees, presumably, in the holds of ships and things like that. And this is rather, this is a picture taken from quite far away, just above the roofs of these houses. You can see this gigantic tree, and this is actually a London plane. Many of you, I think, will be familiar with the London plane and its peeling bark. This is actually a really big tree. And I would say this is probably one of the half dozen biggest trees in Faversham. And if you look up and you see, it's a perfect example of a beautiful spreading canopy. And if I were ever to have to draw a tree or paint a tree, it's that sort of architectural feel to the branches and twigs, and I would feel that I'd captured it pretty well, perfectly, if I managed to get that sort of image in. As we just go a little bit further along the path, we must be now, I think, about 3/4 of the way along our little walk. We've already seen a huge number of trees, and this one was taken a few weeks ago. This is actually one of the silver maples that is along the path. We just mentioned it as that big tree that had lost all its leaves earlier on. Well, this a few weeks ago, and it was still covered in beautiful silvery leaves, which gorgeous shape. Another couple of Lawson cypress along the path there, and beautiful. Another one of the couple of hundred varieties that there are of this amazing tree that has been so well bred and planted in various parts of the UK. As we move just further along, we come across another horse chestnut, and this one has got really quite a twisty trunk to it. And one of the things you will see is that there's quite a lot of damage being done to the main trunk. And I rather think this is a sign of one of the diseases that's sweeping throughout the country, really. And this disease has attacked the tree. It's called horse chestnut bleeding canker. And you can see a little bit of dark material bleeding away from the damaged bark low down, a nice little sort of crack for a bat to peel into, to roost for a couple of nights, perhaps, you never know. whether a pipistrelle will get in there or not. So really quite an interesting tree from the biodiversity point of view, and really quite a nice horse chestnut. Most horse chestnuts won't die of bleeding canker. They do seem to be able to develop a resistance, a systemic acquired resistance, and recover. And this one seems to have thrown the disease off, and I have great hopes of it lasting another 50 or 100 years, despite all the things that we are throwing at it by introducing different pests from different parts of the world. One of the things we'll see with many of the horse chestnuts, and the common horse chestnuts we get around, is that all their leaves turn brown late in the summer. And this because each tree is actually affected by millions of caterpillars of a tiny micromoth that comes from the Balkans area of Europe. And this has really only been in the UK for about 20 to 30 years. It's really only been sort of found in anywhere apart from a small area of northern Greece, Macedonia, that sort of area, over the last few decades, and it just seems to have exploded out of nowhere. And now there are billions and billions of these moths and caterpillars all over Europe, turning the leaves of the horse chestnut brown. This does seem to affect the vigor slightly, but it's not a killer, and the horse chestnuts seem to come back year after year after year. But the sooner we get a biological control, or the blue tits learn how to get at the caterpillars, the better, I think, for all the horse chestnuts planted in the UK. This one here is a poplar. It's not like the Italian poplar that we had earlier on at the start of the walk. There's a far more spreading tree. And again, it's really quite a big trunk here. And you can just see a bird box just on the northern side of the tree, overhanging the stream. It's really quite a tremendous tree. It's a huge amount of foliage. It would be wonderful for supporting aphids, for feeding birds and bats and mice and things of that sort. Little elder along at the base of it. This is what you might call a railway poplar, I think, possibly Cultivar serratina, one of the hybrid black poplars. We do have native black poplars, but there are only about 1,000 or so trees in the whole of the country. There's the bird box, I think it is, that is on the side of the poplar tree. And then the next tree along, we're just finishing off the last few trees. And here we have a crack willow, a native willow, which is renowned for spreading along by broken twigs. And if you just take a twig of the tree and just bend it backwards from the main stem, you'll hear it crack and fall off. It's a very fragile tree structure where all the twigs are very easily broken off. And then, of course, they're supposed to float downstream, bury themselves in the mud, and form new trees. And that's one of the main ways the tree spreads, by natural vegetative reproduction along the rivers and streams of southeast England. And this one here, I think this one's a sycamore. You can see that the tree has been subject to a little bit of pruning, and indeed the council does come along and prune these trees. And I think one of the things they've been trying to do, I rather suspect, is to try and prevent children climbing on them too much. And it seems to me that many of the lower branches are being cut off, partly with that aim to give you a nice clear sort of landscape, so as you can't hide behind low-growing branches and things of that sort, and that you can't climb the trees so easily, which could possibly, I suppose, produce a health and safety hazard if you're worried about that sort of thing. Not entirely sure that I approve of all these things, particularly when you look at the lower branches, which are spreading out on the left-hand side here. And when you look closely at them, can you see all those lichens and mosses and things like that growing on these lower branches? It's really quite an important habitat. So I always think it's a shame if lower branches have to be removed from trees. It reduces the bird nesting opportunities and reduces all these things that are growing on the trunk. So it's a bit of a shame, but maybe that's what they think they have to do. Nice little bench there, just as we're coming towards the end. I think the bench was originally placed the other way round, so as you would have been able to sit down and have a lovely view of the fence. And local reaction was, that's probably not a good idea. why don't we turn the bench around so as you can look at the stream and see whether you see a kingfisher going past or anything of that sort. And so that's the end of the walk on our bench. So we sat down on a bench to have a little bit of rest. And here we, I would say, what a wonderful linear green space it is. What a tremendous number of different trees that you can find along this walk along the Westbrook. And what an amazing little spot it is for Faversham to enjoy. So, guys, I don't know whether that has been accurate or anything of that sort. I see there are a few things in the chat. Do we want to try and pick up some of these questions, folks? Should we just have a look at that?
Some of the things that were raised, when you were talking about the chestnut at the beginning, I took a flower from it last spring and drew it many times, and to my amazement it had yellow and pink flowers on it on the same flower head. Is that a usual thing with horse chestnuts?
And it's rather an amazing thing. So I think I need to get this the right way around. The flowers start off, if I remember right, with pink in the center of them. And it is thought that the bees can somehow detect either this or some thing associated. When you look at a little clump of the flowers, the pink ones are the ones that are just available to release pollen and things like that. And as they get pollinated, they pardon me, they change from a pink to a yellow color. So when you're looking at a clump of the flowers, you can see how many pink ones they have, which are the new ones, and how many yellow ones they have, which are the older ones. I hope I've got that sequence the right way around. And quite a few species in the Aesculus genus of horse chestnuts do this. And you can see them change in color day by day. Now, I hope nobody is going to ask me how they do it, because I haven't got the faintest idea, Griselda. I just know that they do.
It's very, very pretty, I must say. Now, next, someone said, Graham asked, is that ivy going to kill the trees? Near the beginning of the walk, you had some trees covered in ivy. What you were saying, ivy is very good for biodiversity, but does it kill trees?
It doesn't kill trees directly, but it can be a big problem when you have a tree which might not be in the best of health. It may not have a really good canopy. And when you get a thin canopy, the light gets through, and that allows the ivy to really get quite big and cover the whole stem. And one of the problems with that is the ivy being evergreen can create a little sail which will catch the wind. And this may actually reduce the stability of a tree that's naturally weak anyway. And therefore, ivy in the middle of towns and next to roads, particularly when it's excessive and out of balance with the canopy, is rather regarded by tree safety experts as something that ought to be controlled. So we leave it as much as possible for the biodiversity, but where it might pose a stability issue for the tree, then we might want to cut the ivy back a bit, and we cut it off from its roots at the base and see whether we can keep it under control to reduce the sail effect. The other rather ridiculous reason for removing ivy is that when a tree surveyor wants to check the trunk of the tree, he can't see it through all the ivy, and therefore it's more convenient for a tree surveyor to ask for the ivy to be removed. Personally, I'm not entirely sure that that is a very good idea, but there we go. So some safety reasons, but the ivy itself doesn't seem to damage the trees. And in fact, modern view is that it may not actually be a good idea to remove ivy even from old walls, because the ivy may be protecting the wall from the ravages of the weather. About 20 years ago, people always used to say, oh, you've got to have all your ivy off your old wall. Well, if your ivy is established on an old wall, maybe get some expert opinion before you remove it. Might be a bit of an issue.
Thank you. Now, the next thing was, you mentioned some use with berries and some without, and Fern said use with berries are females and without are males, with a question mark. And she says also sometimes as they get very old, they can have branches that change sex.
Absolutely, and you do get the same thing with ash trees. Ash trees tend to be male when younger, and then as they gain experience, they seem to like to change to being female.
Very wise.
I make no further comment.
Yeah. Shirley was asking about Clematis tangutica and asking if it's native to Kent.
Was that tangutica that we had that picture of?
I don't know. You had all that old man, like old man's beard, was it?
Yes, it was after the picture of the ivy flowers.
Clematis vitalba, I think. Clematis vitalba is our native old man's beard for Kent. Most of the other clematis species, as far as I know, are exotic. I think Clematis vitalba, the old man's beard, is the only native species of clematis we have, but always subject to correction by any experts here.
And Tim Ingram and Tim and Gillian looked it up and said that the tangutica is from Mongolia, so not native.
Right, okay, yeah.
Oh
dear, now, I didn't say it was native, did I?
No, you didn't. No, it was just a side conversation. That's right. So then Shirley was asking what girth measurement is required to go on the ancient tree register. And I seem to remember you talked about 5 feet from the ground. And I think Andrew and I did measure that willow, and I did try and put it onto some kind of database, but it obviously isn't the same one that you were looking at, you know, the Kent, I don't know, the Woodland Trust one.
Ancient Tree Inventory. Yeah, the Ancient Tree Inventory is the national database of all the older trees in Britain. So you've got to be quite big and preferably a native tree really to go on that, ideally. But I think if I were you, I'd have a word with the Kent verifier for the Ancient Tree Inventory and ask whether he can push one in if it's on the boundary. It happens to be me at the moment, so I can try and get one through for you if you speak to me nicely.
Very good, thank you. And I think you said 5 feet up from the ground. Is that right? 1.5 meters or something like that? About
1.5 meters is a good thing. But if there's a branch in the way or a big bobble or something like that, you try and take the sort of thinnest measurement. So you might have to go down a bit, you know, to allow for a branch coming out, just to try and get. You're looking for the waist of the tree if it's got one.
Okay. Now there's a question that I had, which was about whether we should we be considering new plantations along this walk, and if so, what species would you think suitable? For example, we didn't see any hawthorns along here, but maybe it's too wet by the stream.
I don't know that it would be too wet. I think some hawthorns would be quite nice. If you're going for native, of course, you're going for something which can have quite sharp thorns on it. But there are some hawthorns which are pretty near spineless or thornless that might be quite interesting, that produce a good, really good show of flowers. So that might be an ornamental hawthorn, although exotic, although not native, might be a reasonable compromise for that sort of thing. People tend to be a little bit cautious about planting thorny plants along where children are in particular, because you know, of any possible litigation risk.
Yes, and Tim and Gillian are asking about alder, for example.
Yes, I didn't see any alder along the walk there. There are some alders further along, I think, over the bridge and further along where it gets a bit wilder. But yeah, alder would definitely be a possibility. And of course, in January, if you get a couple of alders and you get siskins and redpolls pulling the seeds out of the cones and things like that, that to me is one of the absolute delights of an English winter.
Fantastic.
Say that there is a tree person from KCC whose job it now is to look at tree cover from the pond, the whole length of the stream. We're expecting 3 trees to go in very close to that bench, and further along he's got other plans, so that's already underway. Yeah,
that's brilliant.
Yeah,
I think that actually comes to the end of all the questions that went into the chat. And of course, now people may have questions they want to raise themselves now. So if there's anything anyone would like to ask.
Absolutely. Open house for the last few minutes.
You may have to unmute yourselves if you want to talk.
Okay,
All done?
it doesn't sound as if there's a lot. One thing I do want to say to everyone is that David is talking again to us tomorrow about another very important theme of our tree week, which is to look for people who would like to become tree champions or tree wardens. And that will be at 2 o'clock tomorrow. And we do hope that anybody who's remotely interested will take a look at that. I don't know if you want to say anything about that now, David.
No, it's just an informal chat really. If people are interested in protecting trees or increasing the tree cover in Faversham, or just interested in trees and want to sort of join in this sort of networking type thing, which it would be great to keep going sort of year round rather than just in Tree Week. So maybe see you tomorrow night, but otherwise thanks ever so much for attending, and I hope it's been of a little bit of interest. I must say you've got a fantastic walk in a fantastic town there.
Thank you very much for a most interesting and very erudite talk. What I love is your familiarity with all the details of the different species and varieties and all the biodiversity that is attracted to any particular plant. And it's just so inspiring to hear you talking about all that. So thank you very much. We're very lucky to have you. Thank you. And good night.
Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for coming along, everybody. A really good evening. Thank you. That's it.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone.
Bye everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Good night.
Bye.
Hi Griselda and Shirley.
Thank you, David.
How did that go? Was that all right?
Very well, yes. I'm going to stop.
Is the audio okay?
It was fine. I'm going to stop it recording in a second.